Hi, everybody. This is Richard White, and this is the second in our two-part series introducing object-oriented programming in Python. In the first part of the series, we looked at how you can create contact information for your friends. We created a person class. That person class allowed us to create instances of the class or objects, and each person object would have attributes, that is variables, instance variables that we could use to keep track of information about that person, their name, their phone number, and their email address. And then we also wrote some methods or functions inside that class that we could use to interact with those attributes. The first time you look at object-oriented programming, for many people it's a little bit confusing, so it's important to do a second example right away, and that's what we're going to do today. Today we're going to write a program that keeps track of your wardrobe. And to do that, we're going to write a clothing class and then write a program that allows us to interact with that class. As before, we're going to step away from the keyboard before we even start programming, and we're going to think about designing that clothing class. So it might be a good idea to pause the video here and think about what attributes, what variables you would want to include as you consider a clothing class, and what methods you might write to interact with those attributes. And then we'll come back, go ahead and start up the video. I'll show you what I'm thinking about in terms of this class, and we'll go from there. Okay, there are lots of different ways that you could describe an article of clothing. Its name, its color, whether it's shirt or pants, socks or underwear, what the fabric is, when you bought it, how much you like it. We've got a limited amount of time here, so for the clothing class, I think what I'm going to do is just describe it in terms of two things. You may have come up with more, but for us, we're going to start with these two. We're going to have the name. That'll be one of the attributes or instance variables that we'll use to keep track of that clothing. And then I'm going to track whether or not it's clean. Clean is going to be a Boolean variable. It will be true if it's clean. Otherwise, it'll be false. Clean will be false if the clothing is dirty. And we also need to think about what kinds of methods we should have here, what kinds of functions we should include. And I think at the beginning, we'll modify this in just a few minutes, but I think at the beginning, let's just do getName as we did before. That'll be one of the methods that we can call that will return the name of the clothing. And we'll also have a method that refers to its cleanliness. And maybe we can just call that isClean. That'll be a Boolean variable or a Boolean method that will return true if the clothing is clean, and otherwise it'll be false. So let's start with that for our class. Let's go ahead and get back onto the computer, and we'll write that class, and then we'll write a short little test program to see how it works. All right, so here we are. We're in the terminal. We've got a couple of windows set up here. And on the left side, I'm going to be writing my code, and on the right side over here, I'll be running that code and testing it. So I've already gotten my shebang set up here, and I've got a little doc string set up there with my information. And I'll be running a main program to test all of this. This is going to test the clothing class in just a few minutes. And then I've got my if name equals main down there. So I guess the first thing I want to do then is write that class. And if you remember, the way we write that class is we use the keyword class. We indicate what the name of the class is going to be. And then in parentheses, we're going to put the superclass here, which is object. It turns out that that's optional actually there for Python, but we're going to go ahead and put it there for form's sake. And I'm going to put a doc string here just to describe what's going on here and explain that the clothing class defines a piece of clothing in terms of its name and its cleanliness. It'll be clean or dirty, cleanliness. And so let's see what that's going to look like. I guess the first thing I'm going to have to do is initialize. Remember, we defined the $_init function. And with objects, you always have to begin the list of parameters with self here. When I create this clothing object, I'm going to give it a name. So the name will come in here. And I'm also going to state whether it's clean or not. Now, another thing that we can do here is we can assume that it's going to be clean here. So I'll put in a default value here. When you put in a default value as a parameter, when you say equals something, then that means that if I don't specify the cleanliness at the time I create the object, then it's going to take on that default value. So we'll assume that it's going to be true unless I state otherwise. And then down here, that initialization. So my instance variables are going to be name. So I'll take whatever the name is that they're sending, that parameter that's coming in, and I'm going to assign that to the instance variable, self.name. Those are actually two different variables, the parameter value coming in and self.name, which is the instance variable. And then I'm also going to take self.clean, and I'll set that to whatever clean is. And again, if they don't send in a value for clean, then I will just assume that it's true here. That's what this default value is. And then we'll set that instance variable to whatever that value is, either the one they sent in or the default true value. Good, so that's how I create a clothing object. And how would I actually do the object then in my main program here? I could say something like my jeans are going to be equal to a clothing object. And I have to send in the parameters. I don't send in anything for self, remember, that's kind of invisible here, but I do have to send in a name and potentially whether they're clean or not. So I'll put in the name blue jeans, because that's what they are. And I'll say that they are not clean. I'm going to send in false for their cleanliness. And I'm also going to have my shirt. I'll make a shirt. Let's make them shorts for now. That's going to be clothing, and these are my shorts. And I'm just going to assume that they're true. I could put true in there, but I'll just give it the default value there. So in the main program, these two lines here create those two clothing objects. Now, I'm obviously going to want to be able to get information about those. So remember that we said we were going to have a getName method. So that self parameter is not actually a parameter, it's just a reference to the instance, the actual object itself. And I'm going to return self.name. This is a way of me being able to get the information, the name, back out of that object. And then I probably also need what? I need a get cleanliness, or I think we said it was going to be is clean. And this will identify for us whether or not the object is clean or not. So I'll return self.clean. So this is what I've got so far. This is my clothing object. I think I'm all set to go here, or I should say my clothing class. When I create these clothing objects down here, then I can see how they all work. I could print my jeans dot name, get name. Let's try that out. We'll do that in a moment. And I could also print my shorts dot, let's get their cleanliness state is clean. We'll check to see whether the shorts are clean or not. We're expecting true for the jeans and false for that. So let's actually save that, and now I'm going to go over here and I'll run that and see what happens. Python wardrobe 1, and those are my blue jeans, and I got true because the shorts were clean. So that worked just fine. Remember one of the things we tried to do before, if I print out my jeans, is that going to work for us? Will Python allow us to print out an object like that? If we run that program again, it is printing out the status of that object, although it's not maybe as nicely formatted as I'd like, and I'd really like to know what the name of the object is and whether or not that object is clean or not. I don't need to know the memory address here. So you remember how we fixed that over here. We created an additional method, double underscore string. We were overriding the string class from object, or overriding the string method, I should say, from object. And the way you do that is you just put in what you'd like to return for this particular value. So for clothing, I think I'm going to be returning the name of the class, square brackets, name equals, and then I'll also return the self.name. And then I'm also going to return, I'll do a little new line there, I'm also going to return, comma, self.clean. Clean equals, don't like to have a space there. Clean equals plus self.clean. Do you think that's going to work? That may not work. We'll have to take a look and see. and then I'll close out the square brackets. Why don't I think that's going to work? Because that's a Boolean variable, and if I'm trying to return a Boolean variable as a string, that usually doesn't work. So let's try it and see what happens when I print out my jeans again. Yeah, can't convert Boolean object to string implicitly. I got an error message there. So let me jump back in here, and I can convert that to a string by closing it in parentheses. That'll take that Boolean value and convert it to a string that can be printed out. So let's see what it looks like now when I run that. Good, so I'm getting blue jeans, I'm getting true for the cleanliness on the shorts, and clothing, name is blue jeans, clean equals false. So this is giving me a nice little demonstration on how I can manipulate a simple clothing object here, or at least access the information for that object. That's working great. I've got a little bit of a problem here because my clothes might be clean or dirty, but I don't have any way to change the value of the cleanliness variable. It would be nice to be able to wash my clothes, maybe. So let's figure out how we're going to do that. Let's do that by, I'm going to go ahead and close this out here, and we'll make a copy of wardrobe 1. We're going to call this wardrobe 2, make some modifications here, and then let's take a look at wardrobe 2.py and see what we're going to change there. Well, maybe you've already noticed I can have my clothes either be clean or dirty, but there's no way for me in this class here to change the state of my clothes being clean or dirty. So I'm going to add a couple of things here. I want to be able to describe my clothes in terms of 2 additional attributes here. So take a look at this. I'm going to include the number of times worn, and I'm going to assume when I create an article of clothing that the number of times it's been worn is 0. I suppose if I create a new piece of clothing that somebody has given to me and it's already worn, it might be worn, but otherwise I'm going to assume it's going to be 0. It will have never been worn. And I'm also going to keep track of the maximum number of wears that that article can have before I consider it to be dirty. So for instance, you know, my socks and my shirts, I wear them once, and that's the maximum number of times I can wear them. After that, I'm going to consider them dirty. My pants, sometimes I'll wear those 2 or 3 times before I wash them. If I have a hat, I hardly ever wash my hats. I don't think I wash my hats. It would take thousands of wears before my hat would be dirty. So I'm going to assume that the maximum number of wears for any article of clothing is 1, unless I state otherwise. So those are the default values. And what that means is I need to create the initial values for these guys in my object here, in my class. Self times worn is going to be equal to whatever value they send in. Might be the default value of 0 up here, or it might be whatever value that they specify. And then I'm also going to need another attribute here, another instance variable for max wears. And the max wears is going to be whatever they send in as that parameter. Okay, cool. I've got more stuff. And if we were just being simplistic about this, I suppose we could write a couple of setters that would set the number of times worn and set the number of max wears. If we wanted to change those. But I'm going to do something a little bit more sophisticated here. I want you to think about what would happen if I, well, every time I wear an article of clothing, let's say I want to really make this abstract idea of an article of clothing something that represents the real world. If I call a wear method on my article of clothing, then what happens? What happens when I wear an article of clothing? Which of these instance variables up here, name, clean, times worn, and max wears, is going to change, if any? The name is probably not going to change. I'm not going to change the name of my clothing. The number of times that I've worn it, when I wear it, that is going to change. Self.times worn needs to go up by 1. Because every time I wear it, then if I'm tracking the number of times I've worn it, since it was last clean, then I'm going to need to add to that. Does that mean that my clothing is going to be dirty now that I've worn it once? It kind of depends on what the max wears is. So I'm actually going to have another line in this method that checks that and says, if the number of times that I've worn this article of clothing now is greater than or equal to, is more than or the same as the number of maximum wears I'm allowed before I consider it dirty. If it's greater than or equal to that max wears, then I'm going to have to set the cleanliness value to false. Before it was true, maybe, or maybe it was false and I wore it anyway. Self.clean is definitely going to be false if I've exceeded the maximum number of wears that I'm allowed for that piece of clothing. That'll be interesting to see how that works. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. I also want to be able to wash my clothes. What happens when I wash my clothes? If I wash this article of clothing, which of these attributes are going to change? The name's not going to change. Maximum wears is not going to change, but the cleanliness is going to change, isn't it? I think if I wash my clothes, I presume that the clothes are now going to be clean. So self.clean is going to have to be reset to true. And what about the number of times worn? Remember, that actually represents the number of times worn since the clothing was washed. So if I'm washing the clothes, I need to reset times worn to 0. So I can wear my clothes, I can wash my clothes, and let's take a look then and see what happens when I run. Ooh, I'm going to have to change this, aren't I? I'm going to have to change. I'm going to have to include a little bit more information here in my string method. So I'm going to need to keep track of times worn. Yeah, times worn is equal to. And the number of times worn, that's going to be an integer because I'm adding 1 every time. I am going to need to convert that to a string if I want to be able to print it out here. Self.times worn. And then I'm also going to be printing out the, what is it? The max wears. Max wears. Same thing there, self.max wears. So I've changed that, and let's make up a test here. Let's change our test a little bit. What am I going to do? I've got my jeans. I'm making some jeans here. I'm going to wear the jeans once. And then I'm going to print out what the jeans are doing there. I'll print my jeans, and we'll take a look at that status there. I'm going to wash my jeans. And then I'll print out again the status of my jeans, and we'll see what that looks like. My jeans, oh, I don't have to do that. Good. Let's take a look at that program and see what that looks like when I run it over here. Python wardrobe 2. And, oh, I have a syntax error. Did you catch that? You probably caught that. Up at line 28 here, I need a colon after that. Try again. Good. So the first time, my blue jeans, they were false. I wore them once, okay, and the max wears was 1. After I washed them, I printed out their status again. Notice that they're now clean. The number of times worn has been changed to 0. Of course, the maximum wears is still 1. So it looks like that's working just the way I would expect that it would for that wardrobe 2. I've got a clothing object here, and I can describe it in terms of the name, the cleanliness of that clothing, and I can both wear and wash any item of clothing that I make. Pretty cool. We've got one more thing that we're going to add to this idea of clothing. It's one of the most important aspects of object-oriented programming. Very cool. That's what we're going to do next. All right. You may recall from our first lesson that one of the things we talked about was this idea of inheritance, that a superclass can have subclasses underneath it that inherit from that superclass. The quick example that we gave there was the fact that the clothing class inherits from the object class. And that means things that are defined in the object class can automatically be used by the clothing class. In fact, we had a string, a double underscore string method here that was inherited from the object class, and we needed to override it in the clothing class if we wanted to make it our own there. In the same kind of way, we can write our own subclasses. So I want you to think about this. If I've got a clothing class, and that's working pretty well, I can initialize a clothing class in terms of all these values here. what if I had a shirt class? What if I wanted to keep track of my shirts? Are shirts a type of clothing? Of course. I could consider the shirt class to be a subclass of the clothing class. I could also, of course, write my own shirt class. I could write a brand new shirt class and have it not inherit, but there are advantages to having that inheritance happen. And so I'm going to go ahead and write this shirt class as a subclass of the clothing class. And what that means is, after I say class shirt, I need to make sure that I put in parentheses the object or the class from which I am inheriting. In this case, that's the clothing class. So shirt is inheriting from the clothing class. And I'm now going to need to define the entire shirt class. This actually turns out to be super easy to do because if I want to initialize everything, I can base it pretty much on the same initialization that I had before. When I initialize my shirt, I'm going to have a name. It's going to be clean. I'll assume true. It's going to have a number of times worn. It's going to have a maximum number of wears. And I'm going to have one more bit of information that I'm going to include for my shirt class. I'm going to keep track of the sleeve length. The sleeve length is going to be either long or short. Tell you what, I'll do, let me call this parameter short sleeves. And that will also be Boolean. It will be assumed to be true. I'll assume that I'm going to have short sleeves unless they specify otherwise. And what that means then is when I initialize this shirt object, well, I'm going to need to somehow set the parameters, set the instance variables to all the values that I've been given here. So this init is what I'm using for regular clothing. This init, which looks almost identical except for the short sleeves there, that init is going to be used if I have a shirt object, a special shirt object. Now, you might think that I'd need to go through and initialize all these variables again, but it turns out because of inheritance, because shirt inherits from clothing, one of the things I can do is at the beginning of my initialization, I can type this. I can refer to my superclass here, that is the clothing class, and I can call the init method up there. Yeah, whether or not that's a method, I don't know. But I can call that an initialization process and send in the parameters that I've gotten from this guy here. What parameters did I get? Well, they sent in name, they sent in whatever the cleanliness was, they sent in the times worn, they sent in the max wears. All that information has been provided by this initialization parameter list. So I'm going to send that information up to the superclass, up to the clothing class. Interesting point here. The superclass doesn't know about short sleeves. The superclass only knows about all these instant variables up here. Short sleeves is specific to the subclass. So I'm going to need to define the short sleeves down here in my subclass. That's going to be equal to whatever the value of short sleeves is. So I've got a bunch of instance variables that belong to the clothing class but that have been inherited by the shirt class, the subclass. And I've got this special short sleeves value that only belongs to shirt objects. So that's going to be how I initialize everything there. That's kind of cool. Do I need any special methods for the shirt class? I get to inherit all these methods here from my superclass. These are all available to me. So I don't have to define those in my subclass. I can just call the same ones that are up there. It occurs to me, though, that I might want to find out whether or not my sleeves are short. So maybe I'll define a method in here. What's that method going to be? Has short sleeves. I can use that there. Self. And how will I know if it has short sleeves? I'll return self.shortsleeves. So that'll return true if I do have short sleeves, otherwise it'll return false. That's kind of cool. Think about this too. I probably want to return, if I print out the shirt class, I want to send in all this information or return all this information, but I also want to send in the sleeve status. So here's what I'm going to do, something else kind of clever here. Look at this. I'm going to say def underscore string self. So I want to print out the shirt, but the first thing I'm going to return before I even do the shirt stuff, well, I'll put the word shirt there. But what I'm actually going to return here is the superclass double underscore string. Sorry, I forgot to end my quotes there. This is going to refer to the superclass, and it's going to refer to the string method in that class. It's going to send that back out. That's going to be awesome. I'm also going to want to send out the short sleeves information. So short sleeves equals, and then I'm going to add in a string representation of whatever short sleeves is. And then I'm going to go ahead and close that out. So this is my new shirt class that inherits from clothing. When I initialize the shirt class, I have to send in the values of all these parameters up to that superclass with this line right here. I also have to initialize the short sleeves instance variable. I have a new method has short sleeves that I might use, and then I had to override the overridden here, and I think that's going to work for me just fine here. Let's try that out and see what happens. I've got a series of testers that I've written down here. Take a look at these guys and see what you think. I've made another change here. I've set up my clothes equal to an empty list, and then what I'm doing is I'm appending a series of articles of clothing, including these blue jeans, including this clothing object, a baseball cap, including this jacket, and I'm now trying to take advantage of the shirt subclass and this shirt subclass. And if I want to print out the full wardrobe, let's do this check first of all. If I want to print out the full wardrobe, how would I print out every article of clothing that I have? I think I could just go through that entire array of my clothes, that entire list. For I in range length of my clothes. And every time I go through, I'll just print out my clothes sub I. I think that'll print that out for me. And then I'll worry about all these later on. Let me go ahead and comment these out right now. I'm just going to put little triple quotes around these guys to comment them out, so that way they won't be available, they won't show up. And let's see what happens when I run this program. Oh, didn't like something there. Oh, I didn't do my continuation. Did you catch that? I have to put a little continuation character there. Now let's try it. Oh, short sleeves, I misspelled something. Look at that. Did you catch that earlier on? You probably caught that and didn't tell me. There's my full wardrobe. Let's see what's going on here. Drag this over and get a good look. So I've got my blue jeans, which showed up. I've got my baseball cap, my jacket. It told me about my shirt, including my t-shirt has short sleeves, and it told me about my dress shirt, which does not have short sleeves. That was false. That's very cool. It looks like it's working just as it should. Very excited about that. Let's go back and test a couple more things here in my main method. Let me jump down here. It's getting a little awkward dragging this window back and forth, but I want to be able to see what's happening here. So you tell me, how am I now going to print out all my clean clothes? What's that loop going to look like? I think I'm going to go for I in range. I'm going to need to go through the entire length of my wardrobe, but I'm only going to print out the ones that are clean. So if my clothes sub I dot, and how do I check? What's the method that I use to check for my cleanliness? Do you remember? Is clean. I use is clean. So if my clothes dot is clean, if that turns out to be true, then I'll print my clothes sub I. Otherwise, I won't print it. To print out the dirty clothes, what is that going to look like? For I in range length of my clothes, same kind of loop. If not my clothes sub I, is clean, then I'll print my clothes sub I. And we'll save this last one here, my shirts. We'll save that for the very end here. I'm going to comment that out for a moment. Let's run that and see what happens. So here are my clean clothes now listed. My baseball cap, my jacket, and my t-shirt and my dress shirt are all clean. It did not print out my jeans. And if I look at the summary of my dirty clothes down here, yes, it's just the blue jeans that are there. So this is working great. Let me ask you one more time then to write this method, or rather this test. How am I going to print out just the shirts? There's a little bit of a trick here because we haven't learned how to print just the shirts. I don't really have any way of testing in my class up here to see whether something is a shirt or not. And it's a little bit tricky because, remember, the superclass clothing doesn't know anything about the subclass shirts. And shirt, well, yeah, you're a shirt. You know you're a shirt because you're a shirt object. But that doesn't really help me here when I'm trying to print out my clothes. So we've got a special keyword that we can use to test for this now. So here we go. For I in range, we'll go through the entire length of my clothes. And here's our new test. If is instance, all one word, is instance. That's a keyword there. You can see it highlighted on my screen there. If is instance, and then you look at the thing, you specify the thing you're looking at. In this case, it's my clothes sub I. And what this says is if my clothes sub I is an instance of the class shirt, then we'll print that item. We'll print my clothes sub I. We'll print just that out. This should show us then just the shirts that are coming out of this thing. Let's try that and see what happens. Clear that out. And down at the very bottom, you can see here, when I'm trying to print out the shirts, it only printed out the shirts that were in my wardrobe. Now, how would you check and only print out the shirts that were clean? How would you modify this? I'm going to change this to clean shirts only. If it's a shirt and if my clothes sub I dot is clean, then we'll print out that particular shirt. Are both those shirts clean? I think both of those shirts are clean, so I need to make sure that one of them is dirty if I'm going to be able to test this. So before I test that, let's make my clothes. Do you know which one it is? This last dress shirt here, we're going to make that false. We're going to wear that dress shirt. That's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's number 4 in my wardrobe. We're going to wear that shirt, and that'll make it dirty, and then it shouldn't show up in our list at the end. So let's run it and see what happens. Clean shirts, the only shirt I had that showed up in my list of clean shirts was the t-shirt, because right before I ran that test, I had set the dress shirt to worn, and that made it dirty. That's really interesting. So we've done a lot here. This is the end of our two-part series here. Obviously, we've covered object-oriented principles, attributes, methods, how you write an object, or I should say how you write a class so that you can create objects with those attributes and methods. We've done a whole lot here, but hopefully you hung on for the ride and you have a little bit better idea of how object-oriented programming in Python works. I hope you enjoyed it.